Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this session on safeguarding Asia's prosperity. I'm Jamie Ho from the Straits Times in Singapore, and I'm very proud to be co-hosting this session with the WEF. Let me just get straight to it in terms of the panelists that we have. Before that, though, for those of you who are going to be posting about this, don't forget your hashtags, hashtag AMNC23. So I'll start from that end of the panel. Neeraj Agarwal, he's the regional chair for the Asia Pacific for Boston Consulting Group's business in India, China, Southeast Asia, and Australia. Liu Qian, she's the managing director for the Economist Group, overseeing Greater China, and she's a young global leader. We have Tom Lembong, he's director for Consilience at Consilience in Singapore and a former Minister of Trade, Indonesia, and still a young global leader, still young.
Old global leader.
And we have Secretary Ivan John Uy from the Department of Information and Communications Technology in the Philippines, and Professor Lee Gun, Professor of International Relations at the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University in Korea. Let me get to the title of this session, and when I first saw the title, Safeguarding Asia's Prosperity, I thought it was a very good, very interesting framing. It underlines that Asia is still there, still prosperous, and what we're talking about here is how to safeguard it and how to keep it. So I thought I'd do a few things. In looking at that title as well, it sort of reminded me of, some would say, a bygone era, where we last spoke. Some of us grew up with this frame of talking about the Asian tigers. Some of us might remember the 4 Asian tigers from many years ago. And it was, in my mind, quite a different time altogether. It seems almost a bygone era where all of us evolved, developed as economies in very different circumstances. There was very strong economic growth, export-led growth. There was predictability in the international order, multilateral trading rules, and that sort of provided the backdrop. The situation that we have today, admittedly, is slightly different. Having emerged from the global financial crisis many years ago now, we're now living in an age of heightened geopolitical tensions. What's happening in Ukraine and Europe is in our headlines every day. We talk about U.S. China relations. We talk about supply chain issues. We've just emerged from the pandemic, climate change, domestic political upheavals, and going back to what I said earlier, there's a different sort of treatment of multilateral trading rules and an international order. So we have a full plate of challenges ahead of us. So I thought I'd just let the panelists at the outset provide their view on what they think are the biggest challenges that Asia faces in safeguarding its prosperity. It could be one of these. It could be none of the above. It could be something else. So maybe I'll start with Neeraj to give us his assessment.
Okay, so Jamie, firstly, very good afternoon to all of you. I resonate with all the points you made, but if I had to pick one, I'll pick climate change. Why do I say that? I deeply believe, is this echoing too much? Is this okay? I deeply believe the battle for net zero will be won or lost in Asia, right, period. Why do I say that? 50% plus of greenhouse gas emission we know is in Asia. If you look at the top 150 polluted cities in the world, 149 out of them are in Asia. Of course, we have big cities, but that's real, it's palpable. You can feel it. That being said, it's not all, and if there was a cataclysmic climate event or temperature change was to rise a lot, 26% of Asian GDP is impacted by climate change. Southeast Asia, even more like 35-40%. But while that's one side of the story, the other side of the story is Asia will also have enormous opportunities to shape the journey on this. It will create a $10 trillion industry on climate change, and I think Asia can partake of close to 40% of that. It can create 100 million plus new jobs. So I also see both sides. I remain an optimist. At the same time, I do want to put this risk and challenge out there on this.
Liu Qian.
Well, thank you, Jamie. Let me start by having both a sort of China perspective, but also a global perspective. So looking around the world, Asia will continue to be the bright spot, really. So we at the Economist Intelligence Unit expect this world's GDP to be growing at 2.1%, and Asia will be growing at 4.2%. And among that, actually half of Asia's GDP comes from China. So when we look at China to be growing at above 6%, that would be a big factor to Asia and the world. But that said, there are also a lot of challenges ahead, and I think one we cannot ignore is around Taiwan. So the tensions between U.S. and China are on the rise, and the risks of miscalculations are something that we definitely cannot ignore. And for all the reasons that we understand, so I won't dive into that. But on top of all the other risks that we mentioned, I'd also like to mention the possibilities of cyber wars. So cybersecurity is really something that we all need to pay attention to. And with the rising and higher cost of direct military confrontations, and also the difficulties in pinning down the the origins of cyber wars. So the risks of having cyber wars at the beginning or as part of or independent from the traditional kind of hot wars that we have are on the rise. And the escalations for tic-tacs are also on the rise. So there will be higher likelihoods for, let's say, a shutdown of a national grid, or the sabotage of an undersea telecommunications or cables and all of that. So I think these are also very important factors that we need to take into considerations.
Great introductory points. And just as a reminder, because great points have already been made, if you have questions, there will be a Q&A as we get towards the end of this session. Tom.
Thank you, Jamie. I would like to start my remarks by focusing on geopolitics and politics. Yeah. First, I would argue that one reason why Asia is a bright spot is because I would argue we have more technocratic governments and policies around the region than in many other parts of the world, where more populist or more politicized and less rational policies may have prevailed in recent months, in recent years. I think to your point, Niraj, about the climate crisis, we have other crises like public health crises, environmental crisis. But as many panelists at the summit have pointed out, the solutions are all there. Like the science is there, the solutions are there. What we need is political will, right? We need political will to push these solutions, and we need technocratic governance to execute and implement, right? Now, here I would actually say that I'm becoming more optimistic with respect to Asia. We've recently had elections in Philippines, before Philippines, Malaysia, like Malaysia, then Philippines, Thailand. Next year we have elections in Indonesia, also Taiwan, outside the region, U.S., November. But I would point out that in most of these elections, a more populist incumbent has given way to a less populist, more technocratic incoming administration. So the very populist President Duterte has given way to, at least in my perception, the more technocratic President Marcos, right? I think after 2 years of political chaos in Malaysia, we now have a more technocratic Anwar Ibrahim government. It's fascinating to see what happened in Thailand, right? The very populist party associated with populist former Prime Minister Thaksin actually slid in the polls, right? Like they lost market share to a more progressive, like openly technocratic party, the Future Forward Party. And I'm hopeful that even Indonesia, where I would admit President Jokowi is also, quite populist, next year there's good prospects of giving way to a more technocratic, less populist style of government, irrespective of which candidate wins, right? So again, I think hopefully the tide of populism around the world is receding. Like we may have seen the high point, like the high watermark of populism with the short-lived prime ministership of Liz Truss in the UK, but then also gave way to the more technocratic Rishi Sunak. But look, at the root of it all, right, is technocratic government, like to basically implement these solutions we already have. And lastly, for now, I would say geopolitics is necessarily also rooted in local politics, right? Domestic politics drives a lot of the actions on the foreign relations front, whether that's the U.S., whether that's Indonesia, UK, arguably also China, right? Each of us has domestic political constraints, sometimes self-inflicted, self-created. But again, here I'm quite hopeful that we've seen the high watermark of populism and we're gradually, pivoting back towards more technocratic governance.
Secretary Hui, I leave it to you.
Well, I'm speaking from the perspective of being head of the Department on Information Communications Technology. So my perspective is digitalization and transformation on the digital arena is progressing at a scale and at a speed that is unprecedented in world history. And in this aspect, as was mentioned, AI, cryptocurrency, Internet of Things, and all of these are coming together. And these, during my conversations with my fellow ministers on IT, we're all discussing standards of data interoperability, of sharing information, since a lot of our digital platforms have no boundaries. So they cross over all the different countries, different hemispheres, and the need for integration, the need for being able to transfer data and be able to share that across the boundaries becoming more and more important. Now, in contrast, the physical world is going the other way. It's not for integration. It's for, it would seem that in the geopolitical sphere, it's divisiveness, more protectionism, more isolation. So that interplay between how technology is progressing, bringing together people, versus the geopolitical scene where you see a physical distancing, I think will be an interesting area to look into. But comparatively, between Asia today and let's say Europe, or what's happening in Europe, a lot of people are looking at certain analogous situation where potentially Asia could mimic what's happening in Europe. But I think I disagree somewhat in that aspect, because unlike in Europe, where although Europe you have an aggregation, political aggregation like the European Union, Asia you have the ASEAN as one of the regional sectors there. But the Cold War in Europe created military alliances that are very strong, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. And that military alliance is, in terms of being able to influence how Europe evolved, is very different. In Asia, there are no military alliances of that nature. So I think something that will trigger a confrontation may not be as imminent, I feel. But nonetheless, there are tensions that are happening, as mentioned by Lois earlier about areas on the Taiwan issue and the South China Sea issue, which occurs quite often. And this may be very disruptive if there are some flare-ups in those areas. Between Indonesia and the Philippines, we hold almost 50% of the nickel production in the world. So can you imagine something that happens in that area? You won't have electric batteries with 50% of the nickel being disrupted. So we're all interconnected. And I think the interplay between the geopolitics as well as the developments in the digital sphere will somehow work its way through in one way or another. So I think those are the things that we need to look into.
You raised some very interesting points, and I'll try to get to some of the things that you spoke about. But before that, Professor Lee Gun, from the academics perspective now, following the only government representative that we have on this panel, from your perch, what are the biggest challenges do we have to look out for in Asia's prosperity?
For the last 20 to 30 years, during which we enjoyed rapid economic growth, we had the so-called golden era of capitalist growth in the 1960s and 1970s. And there were two events that ended the golden era of capitalism. And those two events were the first oil shock and the second oil shock, 1973 and 1979. And the cause of those two events or crises were the supply shocks. The critical materials in those days, the oil, was weaponized by some of the oil exporting countries in the Middle East. And that ended the golden era of capitalism in the 1970s, which started from 1960s. And now in the 21st century, we have another very critical material, which is the blood of the entire global economy, and that is semiconductor, and perhaps batteries and critical materials for that matter. And if there is going to be a supply shock in those three critical materials, that would again end the golden era of 21st century capitalist growth. And we have seen a few incidents where some countries tried to weaponize the supply of certain critical materials or try to take advantage of their market positions. And one of those incidents was, unfortunately, if there is a misunderstanding about this, please correct me. One was China-Japan crisis, and the second was China-Australia crisis, when Australia, the Australian government said we need more investigation in the COVID-19 causes in China. There was an economic sanction by China. And the third was China-Korea relations, when China imposed sanctions on entertainment industries in Korea and also the tourist visits to Korea. So those are some of the potential areas we might see the weaponization of the market position by certain countries. And I do think that some of the liberal Western countries are concerned that a few countries might weaponize the supply of semiconductors, batteries, and critical materials. And that is one of the reasons why we are decoupling. And if there is a misunderstanding, this is a kind of security dilemma between China and the USA. And if there is a misunderstanding escalating, then perhaps there is going to be a decoupling of the entire market and recoupling of the entire market, and they create uncertainty. And I think that is going to be a very, very dangerous uncertainty for the entire economy.
Okay, I'm glad you raised that because it's a good segue into what I think is probably one of the bigger topics that we need to discuss now. And you did mention decoupling and we now called de-risking, and we need to talk about the perspectives of the relationship between the U.S. and China and what it means for all of us here in Asia and beyond. And to do that, I thought I would maybe get the perspectives first from my colleagues from Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia obviously has a very unique perspective on that. Our fates are so intertwined with both countries. Maybe start with you, Tom. I mean, given the realities that we have today, which are vastly different from what Gun said and what I suggested as well from 20, 30 years ago, whether it's a golden age or not, from Southeast Asia's perspective, how do you think we best can find Southeast Asia's, ASEAN's role bearing all this in mind?
So I think one worry that I do have is, especially among the industrial powers in Southeast Asia, a lot of the talk now is about how can we take advantage of the tensions between China and the US, right? How can we capitalize to attract factory investment, attract portfolio investment and the like. And the worry that I have is that that could exacerbate the tensions between China and the US, right? Like if we have this perverse logic where in this conflict between the two biggest economies, there's opportunity, right? Pretty soon you find yourself thinking, well, we should encourage this, right? We should make it worse because that will mean more factories to us, right? So I think it's understandable that if multinational companies have already decided to move their factories or to reallocate their investment, then of course we're going to compete for it, right? I think we need to be conscious that we can take that too far, and we need to pivot a bit, I think, of our rhetoric back towards our common interests and our common threats, right? So I think the middle powers, including Southeast Asia, need to keep pushing China and the US back together again. As naive as that may sound, right? I think, Niraj, I strongly agree with you. The climate crisis is really real. It's really urgent, and it's arrived. It's here now, right? And so it threatens China, US, Southeast Asia, other continents, other countries equally, right? Public health crisis like antimicrobial resistance, right? Antibiotic resistance, plastic pollution, right? Microplastics. These are threatening all populations equally, and nobody can solve it alone, right? So I think whilst there's a commercial imperative to compete for investment, right, to compete for trade, compete for opportunity, I think we also need to be mindful of always advocating, always encouraging the US and China to find common ground, right? Because we need it. Like humanity desperately needs it for the two biggest economies in the world to collaborate, right? And for all of us to collaborate together on our common threats and our common challenges.
Ivan, do you think that's a role that ASEAN can play in, as Tom said, pushing the two of them, at least, if not closer together, then less far apart?
Well, I think ASEAN as an economic group plays a very big role in also influencing how the region behaves. And although we do see the geopolitical tension between the US and China, the ASEAN countries have actually been walking this tightrope and emphasizing not more on the differences, but more on the common agreeable points in handling the situation. So we are looking at how the regional cooperation can be improved, our trade agreements be more liberalized, and as Tom mentioned, there are opportunities in some of these perceived conflicts when there are movements in terms of investments, in terms of transfer of manufacturing capability, in terms of what Professor Lee has mentioned, decoupling and de-risking supply chain. Many of the ASEAN countries are benefiting from that by hosting all of these investments. But at the same time, if the conflict worsens, it's not good for the region either, because then you will have disruption. And again, when those products are made, where are you going to sell it? If both economies on both sides of the ocean do not have the capacity to buy those goods because of the effect that it would have on their respective purchasing capability. So it's a tightrope, and I think so far ASEAN has managed quite well in navigating these rough waters in recent years. On the technology side, there are legislation that's coming out on different areas that also probably could have a negative influence on all of this. And one of the clear areas would be the CHIPS Act in the United States, which mandates really certain restrictions on how these critical and emerging technologies can move out of the manufacturing and into other jurisdictions or other countries. At the same time, you have similar protectionist response also from China. So those things create an increased risk in terms of our production capability and could have a significant impact on our manufacturing and our economy. So those are the perspectives that we have.
Yeah. Neeraj, I'm going to ask you to jump in for your take, but also add to that your view on India's role in all of this too, because there are different views, but there is a suggestion that this is India's time as well. So give us a take on that too.
Yeah, so to build on what's being said, let me maybe put one hard fact on the table. The last 2 decades, world has seen trade grow faster than GDP growth. So trade growth has been faster, which has been a great enabler for low inflation, consumer getting access to goods across. For the first time, the modeling we do for the world forward, this year the trade growth, the world GDP we expect to grow at 2.5% to the point you said, but our understanding is that the trade may grow at 2.3%. While this may seem like a small aberration, this is the first time after 2 decades that trade will grow lesser than the world GDP. And that has huge consequences. And the reason I call this out first is to the point of in this conflict, I think the role and the companies across the world and the consumer across the world are interconnected, right? So their ability to vote with their feet in making these conflicting parties come together is humongous. So I do want to, they're all important actors in this, and it's not just a political issue, but it's also a business issue and a consumer issue. So I think that's something I want to call out. That being said, if I put that aside, if we were to roll the dice forward, I think with the way things look right now, you explicitly asked me about India, and I like to go back to Southeast Asia. So India has been very, I think the 2 things happening in India. One is it's been very strong on the services export side. So less known fact, India exports more services than Saudi Arabia exports oil. We don't often realize that. So that's the size of Indian services export. The second thing is India is doing a lot of changes on its infrastructure side, on the trade treaty side. It's got a demographic advantage. So those things work in India's favor. But that being said, can it really translate that into goods exports, which has historically not been a strength for India, will be an important determinant in that picture. There is intent on that side on trying to bring more manufacturing. This has historically not been the strongest suite for India, and that will be an important actor in this. I think back to the point on, and by the way, Tom, you missed out on there's an important election happening in India next year as well, among all the others. And it's a big election.
Thank you.
On the other one is, I think the Southeast Asian nations are genuinely well placed, geographically, with a strategic neutrality, and I think the trade, all our modeling indicates that $1 trillion plus of trade is going to move more towards Southeast Asia. So I think their ability in the scheme of things to be an important actor is humongous. And in China, I think it's still one of the, as she just said, huge economy. Even if it grew at 4 or 5%, it's the absolute dollars added of humongous. I think the one challenge which it will have is, as a demographic advantage somewhat fades away. Can you do more innovation and move up on the value added side so that the innovation and the productivity advantage keeps you away the wage inflation? I think that's a challenge they will face, really, and that's an important challenge as well. I like to throw in.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you basically asked Tian a question, because I think what I wanted to do was ask her to jump in on what everyone's looking at, and that's the state of the Chinese economy. It's sort of recovery from the pandemic, global growth sort of a little bit of it hinges on China. Talk about that first, and then delve a little bit more into the U.S. China relationship. You spoke about Taiwan, and go a bit more into your concerns there too.
Sure. So we're looking at China's economic growth to be at 6.1%, which is far higher than the government target of 5%. That said, the economy is definitely like the double-digit growth, all of that are gone. And we look at the overall status of the economy, I think there's a very key word, which is lack of confidence. It was really good to see Prime Minister Li Qiang this morning giving us a very solid, down-to-earth, and a strong commitment to opening up and to economic reforms. So that really helps. At the same time, business and also consumers across the economy, people are looking for more solid policies of where this is going. So just to throw out some numbers out there, for instance, the youth unemployment nowadays is above 20%. The disposable income, while it's still growing, is much less, the growth rate is much less compared to before. While it's 6%, 7%, before it was more than 10%. So if you are a consumer, your employment status has uncertainties, your income growth is not as fast before, your wealth accumulation from, say, for instance, the property market are no longer growing as fast. Would you have the same amount of and same level of confidence compared to before? That is a no. And when you look at the manufacturing and property market, and actually to Chinese government's credits, they have all the reasons and temptations to really hike up and heat up the property market again. And yet they're not doing it because they know the importance of a longer term sustainable economic growth. So there is that. And then export, that used to be 35% of the economy. Right now is less than 20%. So all the three pillars, the strong, like high growth period are gone. So what's next? So there are definitely challenges. And then congratulations to India. And now it's the most populous country in the world instead of China now. So there are all those problems. So there are areas for growth, as I mentioned, but also challenges ahead. So we certainly would love to welcome more solid policies from the government. And in relation to the second question you asked about U.S. China, so I lived in D.C. for 3 months last year. And the situation there on China are even worse than I thought. So I'm afraid we've come to the point of even sharing facts and data and talk about being rational, which it's in an ideal world, great. When people are sensible, yes. But unfortunately, the world is in a negative sentiment where somehow we may just have to go through a phase of letting out the frustrations, the angers, and all the negative sentiments. So the situation would be worse before it gets better again. And when I talk to, the China policymakers, the think tankers, the American business that are very close to China, I have that experience. And one thing that worries me is that at least last year, their knowledge about China, even among China experts, a lot of that are just purely wrong. And that worries me because they are supposed to be the world leaders of China hand. And if they get wrong, so that level of misunderstanding, that level of mistrust between the two countries, that will affect everyone in the room. So while some countries, for instance, Singapore, are in a way benefiting from sort of facilitating both sides, I'm afraid more countries will be stuck in between. U.S. would put more pressure on like-minded government for them to choose side, and China would want to win more friends at the same time. So I'm afraid it will get worse before it gets better again. But at the same time, I was traveling a lot in the Middle East, and actually last week in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Singapore, I talked to business on the ground. They also have quite an upbeat sentiment at the same time. While worried, they're also really actively trying to find ways to make money. They're like, I don't care about the rest. I'm just here to find ways to make money. Or in a way, peace and prosperity is what really we're all for. So I hope as businesses, as bridge builders, as the third nation, the economists, we wrote about countries of non-alignments. And globally, we have more than 4 billion people. That's more than half of the global population, living in more than 100 different countries. And these countries, they want peace and prosperity. And a lot of that are here in Asia. So I genuinely hope, in a way, instead of being stuck in between, collectively, these countries of non-alignments, these third nations, can collectively influence the world into a better state.
as moderator, I'm going to try very hard to not leave this panel discussion too negatively or too, at least try to make it a little bit more positive. But before I get there, Gun, would you agree with what Tien said in that looking at how things are going in Washington as well, and we know that elections are going to happen there at some point soon too, by next year. In your mind, do you really think as well that things are going to get a little bit worse before they get potentially at least stabilized, if not better, as far as the geopolitical situation is concerned between U.S. and China?
Well, my view is unfortunately quite negative about the prospect of the global economy. First of all, China has been catching up extremely fast in the area of technology. Artificial intelligence, semiconductors, batteries, China is dominating in those areas. And the U.S. might be very concerned if the U.S. is going to be dependent upon Chinese supply of those very critical materials like semiconductors. And in fact, many of the U.S. weaponry uses Chinese components and parts. So this is a very scary part for the American military planners. And the U.S. is, I think, at all costs trying to decouple those areas where the U.S. might be dependent upon China in supply of those critical materials. And at the same time, the Taiwan question, since I'm a scholar, I try to be as candid as possible. I think Taiwan and China can peacefully coexist together through the market integration. And if there is to be a military conflict, hypothetically, that is going to open the hell gate. It is going to destabilize not only the Chinese and Taiwanese market, the North Korea might be tempted to move with their nuclear weapons. And then that would affect the supply chain of South Korean semiconductors and some of the important commodities, not only the TSMC in Taiwan. And as we have seen in the war in Ukraine, the military conflict is going to create huge damages. I mean, the lives are sacrificed and the supply chain is being disrupted. And the U.S.-China competition based upon this misunderstanding and dependency concern, I think this is going to be a lot more intensive unless these two governments and countries deepen the communication channels between themselves. But it hasn't happened yet.
I've just to let the floor know, I've still got many questions that I'm supposed to ask as moderator, but I see time running out, and I do know that there are probably questions from the floor. Let me open it up now so that I give the floor as much time as possible to questions to the panelists. So the floor is open. Here, can the mic go to this lady in the middle?
Thank you so much for sharing. I have one question for Secretary Ivan. Hello, this is Kathy from Southern Metropolis Daily, and I would like to ask you, since this year, Philippines and China have signed a memorandum on digital and information and communications technology cooperation. I would like to know, how can we promote the digital economic between these two countries, and how this cooperation can safeguard Asia's prosperity? Thank you.
Well, yes. Based on our signing of the memorandum, the digital cooperation comes in many forms, and significant to that would be on the increase of trading on digital platforms, on e-commerce. The ability to be able to exchange goods and then do digital payments over those platforms that are being established in our respective countries. But at the same time, we are learning many things also in developing the technology side. On artificial intelligence, on cryptocurrency, and in logistics, as well as sharing of information on how to deal with climate change, digitalization of agriculture, and how biotechnology and many of the other researches that are happening to increase productivity and resiliency from climate change. The Philippines, a lot of storms go over the Philippines on a yearly basis, and the predictive capability of our weather forecasting should be significantly improved. So access to satellite imagery, to analytics, and computing capacity in order to handle some of those. In the past, from a storm that is category 1 to category 5 could take 5 days or even a week. Today, we have seen storms move from 1 to 5 within 24 hours. So we do not have enough time to warn the population of the immense impact of that. So these are the things that we are looking for cooperation, because we are situated in the same area, but we do have the technology, we do have the information from the satellites and from the sensors on the ground that can help us deal with this.
Thank you, Ivan. Could I have next question over there? In the middle row there. Oh, sorry, I'll get to you after that.
Yeah, this is Jessica from ADP. My question is to Chen. So because you mentioned the consumption or consumer confidence is really low, right? So with the stimulus program going to be rolled out, do you think this will help to regain the confidence level? If that's going to happen, when do you expect? It's going to be second half year or next year?
Sorry, consumer confidence and then something else?
Yeah, the stimulus program.
Yes. Okay. So we've seen some stimulus program, but more are needed. So as I was explaining, while we want to see there is a larger share and a stronger drive from the private consumption part, people don't have enough confidence for that. So imagine you're one of those consumers, each one of us, we're a consumer. So your average income growth rate are lower than before. Your likelihood of getting unemployed is on the rise. Before, even when you do nothing, your wealth coming from the property market are just on the rise, more than 10% or so a year. You feel a lot of confidence to spend. And so according to the Chinese Academy of Social Science, for instance, 88% of Chinese households own some sort of a house. So that basically everyone have that confidence, sort of you have the stock of wealth to go to. And then you see everything on the rosy side. But now everything changes. The property market no longer rising up. Your own income are at some sort of risk. So when you have this, I'm afraid it would be too much to ask for everyone to just go ahead and spend, even with stimulus. Unless you have stimulus every day, which won't happen, then you won't get that going. And honestly, stimulus every day, that wouldn't be a stimulus. If anything, that would be almost a problem, right? So it's almost like when you're sick, you have some medicines, but the purpose is for you to sort of recover fast, right? And once you recover, you will need to rely on economic reform. So basically, go into the gym, sleep early, wake up early, and do all of that instead of saying, oh, the medicine is great, let me take more medicine. Wait a second, the medicine is not working, let me take even more medicines. And I think and I'm not talking just about China, but overall globally. In fact, a lot of economic stimulus we've been having since 2008. So the world have been on over-stimulus for too long. And there will come to a point where we will fail that the medicines will no longer be working. So while stimulus work many times, I'm afraid more fundamentally is the economic reforms that matters. Where do you go to? Is it to give the companies more confident? Is it when it comes to the demographics or fertilities? What about tax reforms and all of that? Fundamentally, I would rely more on the economic reforms rather than stimulus. Thank you.
Thanks, Chen. I'm going to ask the mic for the gentleman at the back. Sorry I missed you at the beginning because the lights are in my eyes. At the back there, yeah.
Distinguished panel, thank you very much for your very candid views. I have a two-point question. First, on the current geopolitics situation that we've discussed a bit, where are the disconnects rooted? Because for the last 25, 30 years, there was a lot of collaboration happening in the economy number one and economy number two. And both were kind of riding on each other. And where is this current set of difference in approach is rooted from, and where do you see it? Whether it is on technology side of it or whether it's on the currency side of it, if you could share your views. The second point and question is on, what are the best case scenarios, in case of this conflict, not to go the way where everybody is thinking it may, and what needs to be done to go in that direction?
Okay. Thank you. As moderator, I will assign the responses. Gun, maybe you take the first part of the question.
Could you summarize the first question?
I think the first question is basically where did it all originate from?
Yes.
What is the crux that has landed us in this situation today as far as the geopolitical situation is concerned between the U.S. and China specifically, I presume? What's the crux of it in terms of where it came from? That's the first part. And the second part is a slightly more optimistic question, which I'm going to make Neeraj think about while Gun answers the first part.
The first?
Yes.
I think there is misunderstanding between the U.S. and China in the area of the usage of some of the vocabularies. The Chinese government has been saying the multipolarity of the international order, and the Westerners, or perhaps the American government or the think tanks there, might interpret multipolarity as desegmentation of the international market. And secondly, the technology side of it, the China, as I said, has been catching up extremely fast. And in the previous 10 to 15 years, China has been using its market position to impose influence upon other countries by cutting some of its economic relations. And that created a concern among the Western liberal countries that China might use the similar tactics to create the so-called multipolarity of the international order. I think that is perhaps a misunderstanding that can be solved and cured by a deeper communication between the U.S. government and the Chinese government.
Neeraj, so the difficult question for you then is what's the best case scenario? Gun may have given you a hint, but paint a credible picture for us for the short term.
Look, I think one of the things we tell all the CEOs is to do scenario planning in the world we live today, because the world is so uncertain, and the momentum scenario is not the best case scenario right now, which we talked about at the panel. But the best case scenario is, in a way, back to the future scenario. Back to the past in some sense, scenario. And what can get us there? Certainly, dialogue will always play a very important role. I see some start of the dialogue happening across both sides, which is very good. I continue to believe that corporates play a very important role in making that dialogue happen. Let me call out two factors. I started with climate change as the biggest risk, right? I believe that if there is more conflict, the path to solving the climate problem gets further kicked down the road. The can gets kicked down the road for sure. Inflation, you talked about inflation. I think the more we don't work together, the more inflationary pressures will increase. So both of those have a self-corrective mechanism from a groundswell of consumers, and which then impacting the larger democracies and politicians who think about it. So there is a bit of self-correction. I don't think that's an instantaneous correction mechanism. That has a lag. That's why some people said things may not immediately get better. But that being said, I equally feel if there is more dialogue and there is reasoned debate, that can be, as always, the best remedy for a difficult situation.
I'm glad you raised climate change at the beginning and now again, because as you said, I think that there is potential, as we've seen, that when necessary, the US and China have found it productive and useful to work together for something like climate change.
If I can just jump in on
Yeah,
Neeraj's comment briefly. I just wanted to mention a really important principle in politics, which is that facts don't change people, relationships do, right? So to your point about dialogue, right? You can argue till you're blue in the face based on facts, numbers, but ultimately it's face-to-face, people-to-people, like individual to individual. I think re-engagement, right? Actually at the Young Global Leaders program yesterday, one of our YGLs made a very good observation. Before the pandemic, there used to be more than 400 direct flights between China and US. Today, there's fewer than 30, right? So again, restoring the flow of people-to-people communication, dialogue, right? And Jian, I think I share your worry about misperception, misunderstanding. The less you know each other, like the more alien you seem to each other, right? The less interaction you have, like the more you're going to speculate, guess, wrongly. Whereas, if you just have a meal together, right? If you realize, talk about each other's families, you realize the sort of underlying common humanity, right? And then you begin to solve these misunderstandings, right? I don't think there's a shortcut. I think it's the only way.
Jamie, can I just add to that just one point? I think we went through a period of 2 to 3 years of COVID where there's very little travel, right? And people did, so that entrenched positions further. I think now the fact that travel has started and the more dialogue is happening, I feel that to me is a very positive stimuli as well.
Good point.
And if I may, very quickly, we're helping you. We have a very lively panel here. No, I just want to say that it's really important. I agree with everything that we're saying is on the point that it's really important to rebuild that trust. But I think we are at a very danger point where the willingness to rebuild trust is almost zero. So we need to now first to work on recreate that willingness, and then the next step is to actually work on the trust.
Yep, excellent point. One final question, maybe before I wrap up. Sorry, I have to choose between one of you. I'm sorry, maybe that lady there. I'm sorry. Yeah, can we bring the mic to the front? Short question, ideally, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm a journalist from People's Daily, and I have a question, perhaps a positive one, for the distinguished panel members. I believe that every economy in Asia are hoping for the prosperity in the future. And what do you think can be the potential areas or fields that can drive the new growth of this area? And how should the economies in Asia perform or perhaps cooperate with each other in order to achieve this prosperity? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question, because it's a perfect concluding question as well, and it takes the job away from me. So I'll say, as each of you answers that last question, please, especially Niraj, Tian, and maybe Tom, insert into it as well some element of what businesses can do. Because there are a lot of business leaders here, and I think we want to give them some degree of agency in the kind of actions that you can do to instigate some of that positive change. So Niraj, will you come towards this direction, and we'll end with Gun. Thank you very much for that question.
No, so look, I continue to be an optimist, actually. And if you just look at Asia for a second over the last decade, a lot of positive changes have happened. We have 2/3 of the internet consumers in Asia. We've added $15 trillion of market cap in Asia. $15 trillion. We've doubled the market capitalization of Asia. We have companies which are at scale, which have great confidence, which have technological prowess. And I think that provides a great platform to solve some of the hardest challenges in the coming years. Let me take a couple of them. Health. Health is going to be a big challenge for the world at large. And I would argue some of the solutions will come out of Asia. Asia has a unique problem with an aging problem. Asia has a middle income problem, so they don't have enough resources to throw at it. But there's a lot of technological innovation happening in the health side. So I think the future innovation on the health side and the solutions will come out of this part of the world. Necessity will be the mother of invention in this case. I'll take another example, which is technological driven. Fintech companies. Yeah? You see higher growth in financial technology, fintech companies in Asia than in other parts of the world. The regulation is more progressive, which is I cannot say for other parts of the world as much. Then there is again a need of the hour, because not all consumers are actually part of the financial ecosystem. So that is driving more and more innovation in this space. So that's a positive. I talked about climate change. I said it in the beginning, the battle for net zero will be won or lost in Asia.
I continue to believe more innovation will come out of this part, using the power of technology to solve that. So I feel take health, take climate, take financial inclusion or financial technologies, all of those Asian leaders and Asian companies will play an instrumental role in solving, which many other parts of the world will want to emulate and copy, so that they will create the blueprint for others to follow.
Thank you, Neeraj. Tien.
So I'll have 3 suggestions. They're easy ones and difficult ones. I'll start with an easy one, which is to read The Economist. Not just pure advertisement, but if you think about we really strive to be balanced, to be objective, and many times our predictions turn out to be right. You know, we talk about the 2008 financial crisis already back in 2007. We talk about Brexit 2012, 4 years before it happened. We predicted Arab Spring. Everything was right. So I think being informed, especially in this age of so much information out there, where to go to, how to make informed decisions. So it could be The Economist or very friends that you go to. So be informed. That would be the first advice. A more difficult one, actually, in a way, is to almost to meditate. Because I think now we live in a world that just everything happens so fast. It's very easy to act on your anger, your frustration, all of that. But it's very important to take a pause, reflect before you really act on something. And I just hope, especially all the politicians out there, they can all meditate and try to do something that's good for the longer term. So that's my second suggestion. And the third one really is ultimately related to some of the things we discussed, is for business to really go out there. In reading The Economist is important, but it's also really important for you to actually visit the places. See for yourself. So, you know, I've been speaking to many of the delegates coming to China who haven't been here for, 3 years, 4 years. And, you know, I was visiting like Europe, U.S., Middle East, Asia, and their people's concept about China, many of them are so wrong, scarily wrong. So I would say go out there, really see the place, talk to people, judge for yourself. So see, read, and make an informed decision. Thank you.
Thanks. Tom?
So I think to the question of which areas, right, which sectors, I would start by observing that the good news is in much of emerging Asia, right, we're under-consuming everything. Like per capita income is still low, right, so we're under-consuming like healthcare, education, goods, services, everything, right? So in my view, opportunity is fairly widespread. Except, of course, we go in cycles. So we just had a technology boom. So there's overinvestment in technology, right? So we might next have like a AI boom. But again, I think the opportunities are widespread domestically. Yeah. Now, macroeconomically or more globally, the developed countries now have a major inflation problem, right? Arguably fed by overly stimulative fiscal posture, right? The Economist, I think, had a cover story on this. Fiscal deficits in the U.S., in Western Europe are extraordinary, feeding inflation. But in Asia, inflation is very low. In fact, China is probably flirting with going back to deflation, right? So actually, we can help solve the rich countries' inflation problem by exporting our capacity, right? By, whether it's services from India or, goods and other kinds of services from Southeast Asia, from China, right? So the opportunity is really, really big. My admonition, my plea to corporate players really is that, you mentioned earlier about confidence. I think a big theme at the summit is entrepreneurialism, right? But I really like this phrase by John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, which is animal spirits, right? So each of us as a corporate player, as a political player, as a organizational leader, we need to find ways to generate bullishness or entrepreneurial spirit, right? Like to sort of rekindle like the hopeful attitudes among our own employees, among our staff, among our suppliers, our partners, right? I think, thank you, Neeraj, about necessity is a matter of invention. All these crises should be stimulating us to innovate, right? To come up with new ideas, crazy ideas, and that's where progress and growth comes from. It's craziness like breaking the mold, coming up with totally new things. So again, I remember 5, 6, 7 years ago I was in Davos, and we were also, worried about the outlook, and the phrase there was, we're going to end up talking each other into a recession, right? Because we're, the rhetoric, and again, I think we have the young global leaders, we have many corporate leaders, we have political leaders. It's really goes back to leadership, right? Like the burden on us, the responsibility of us as leaders in our organizations, in our families, in our societies is really on us to rekindle that spirit of discovery, of innovation, of invention, right? Of naughtiness, of breaking things and rebuilding things, right? Yes. So that's I think really key.
Thanks, Tom. Ivan.
Well, coming out of the conversation of Tom on innovation, I think that's one of the key areas where we can look optimistically to. Innovation is one of the main driving force where we can really push for the development in all our respective economies. There's no argument. All of us are connected. And we saw that during the pandemic where it's not just a problem of one country. When something happens in one country, it just spreads and hits everybody, and then we're all in the same boat. It's the same thing with the Ukraine conflict. We thought that it's on the other side of the world and nothing's going to happen in Asia or the rest of the world. Then we see all these big issues on energy supply, on
wheat,
and on
oils,
food, and all of those things that are happening. So really the message that I think we need to convey to our politicians is that we live in one world, and what happens to one happens to all. And these I wouldn't say them petty, but the political dynamism in determining how the world should be run, I think should gradually shift to maybe the businessmen, the traders, the economists, where we look at things from a more global perspective rather than a very local political perspective. We see the interconnections of digital technology, of the economy, of the finance, of food production and supply, and all of those, and realize that the importance of being together, because in one world, climate change, somebody produces more carbon emission, doesn't affect that country only. It affects everybody. So I think the mindset, the reminder, again to everyone that we're all in this together, and to make things work for the sake of humanity, for the sake of our survivability as a species, I think really depends on all our hands. And as they say, maybe don't leave too much decisions on the politicians.
Thanks. And I'm going to leave the most difficult decision, which is to the political scientists, to try and end us on continue the positive note. So Gun.
If you read the history of evolution of the capitalist market, when the previous market gets saturated, the advanced economies create new market. The financial industry, IT, knowledge industry, content industry, those are the creation of new markets. And I do see bright hope in two industries. One is green industry, because of the climate change, which includes electrification of a lot of things. And the second one is artificial intelligence and fourth industrial revolution. But one caveat with the artificial intelligence is that I hope that the tech companies, particularly in the USA, would not dominate the whole industry because of the platform and network effect that artificial intelligence platform creates. And that is a caveat, but those two areas are the bright spots.
Okay, thank you very much. Panelists, thank you so much. We've extended by a little bit, but I think it was worth it. There was a lot of food for thought. to all of you, thank you for staying through all of it as well. Thank you very much.